Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Hebrews. Today, we're going to be in verse 29 of Hebrews chapter 11. And this one is going to be a little bit different for a couple of reasons. Number one, because up until now, every verse we've talked about in Hebrews 11 has been about an individual, with the exception of the one verse about Moses' parents, but that was just a couple. Every other one has just been an individual. But this verse, for the first time in this chapter, is going to be about an entire group of people, an entire population, the Israelites as a whole. And so, what the verse says, verse 29, by faith the people, that is the Israelites, passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Now, to your point a few minutes ago, Kim, I was thinking the exact same thing. Not only just you talking about reading in Hosea, but just thinking about the context of the book of Hebrews as we have been in the last year or so. We have repeatedly talked about, historically, the Israelites, mainly during the wilderness wanderings, about how many times they failed to believe God, and how their faith was weak, and how they grumbled and complained about this and that. We talked about it at nauseum, and as a matter of fact, many times the author of Hebrews pointed out the faithlessness of God's people. But here, of all places, in the chapter about exalting the importance of faith, the author of Hebrews lifts up the Israelites as examples of doing something by faith. So on the surface, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So what we need to do then is to, as we have been doing all along, go back to the context and look at the setup of what he's referring to here specifically. And it's interesting when you look at it in that perspective and focusing on the attitudes of the people, then you begin to realize what he's talking about, and it actually does make sense. Now, I will say, it is one of those examples of a nugget of faith, a moment when they made the right decision. That doesn't mean that their whole lives were characterized by faithfulness, because obviously during this period of history they really weren't the best examples overall of faith, as we know once they get into the wilderness, especially even once they get into the land for that matter. It's just as bad if not worse. But in a way though, that's almost an encouraging thing, because in our lives we have moments where we do exercise faith and we do make the right decision and we do believe. But that's usually like a little island in the middle of an ocean of where we failed or made the wrong decisions or didn't believe God or griped and complained just like the Israelites. And so yes, I can point to, to moments of faith in my life, but it's kind of like, you picture the string of Hawaiian islands out in the middle of this big Pacific Ocean, and then you got these little dots of land, That's kind of like my life of faith, this big ocean of failure, and then these little dots where, okay, this moment I believed God and I did the right thing, and I could look back and say that was a moment of faith in my life. By faith I did something, but there's a sea of not so good surrounding it. So this is one of those examples in the life of Israel as a whole that is the little island of an example of faith. And I think it's also important to realize when he's talking about the people overall, clearly they're all individuals. So, he's not talking about any one individual. He's just talking about overall the behavior of the people as a population. So, the specific incident that he refers to here is, of course, the passing through the Red Sea. And it's interesting, when I was talking about the life of Moses, and I was talking about how we could talk about the many, impressive things that Moses did, his mighty deeds, the things that make a great movie and everything, and parting the Red Sea was one of them, but how the author of Hebrews, while he may kind of allude to some of those events, what he was really talking about in Moses' life were the decisions that Moses made, the decisions to believe God, and that it was the results of those decisions of faith, where he believed God and said yes to God so God could use him, that the mighty miracles happened. It was not the miracles themselves that the author of Hebrews was concerned about, it was Moses' decision. Well, it's the same sort of thing. We're talking specifically about the big miracle, the parting of the Red Sea. But it isn't the parting of the Red Sea that's important. It's what happens with the people, the decision they're faced with, the consequences of the two paths they could possibly take, and the decision that they ultimately make, and the results of that decision. So the events here, they show this opportunity of the people to exercise faith, but also kind of as a, I don't want to say side note, but as another point, that these events demonstrate this power of God. We have this great physical miracle where God exercises control over the forces of nature, and they demonstrate how he keeps his promises and his love and care for people. He did these miracles as a sign of his love and grace to the people of God, and that he kept his promises. But again, even though that's all true, what the author of Hebrews lifts up here is not the impressive miracles, but this act of faith, this particular decision that they have to make. And while they were not perfect in their lives by any stretch of the imagination, in this one example, they had a decision, a choice to make, and they made the right one. So for the context of this, and so that we can kind of see how this act of faith occurred, we have to go back to the book of Exodus. So put on your time traveling costume and back to the book of Exodus we go. And we're going to really look at really several chapters, Exodus 12 really all the way through Exodus 15, but we're not going to look at every verse, obviously. We're just going to hit a few highlights. We're not going to look at all the details of everything that happened here, though it's a very fascinating and exciting story, but there's certain things we need to focus on in order to understand the context and understand the decision point that the Israelites find themselves in. So where we are, we're in Exodus chapter 12, and down in verse 30 is where we'll start. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. So this is right on the tail end, of course, of the series of plagues that God, through Moses, had brought upon the Pharaoh in order to break his will and to convince him to let God's people go. And there had been plague after plague after plague. And these had all been some form of natural disasters that Pharaoh and his people, they were tormented by, but they had managed to weather them. But this last one, which was the death of the firstborn of every house, had really hit them hard. The Pharaoh's own son was now dead. And so essentially, at this point, for the moment, Pharaoh was broken. This last plague was just too much for him. And that night was a time of awful wailing where every household, except for the Israelites who had put the blood on the doorpost, we talked about that last week, had been spared. But every other household, including the Pharaohs, had their firstborn die.
Really, that was an act of faith too, the putting the blood on the door jamb, because that doesn't make
Absolutely.
sense. Like, why should I put blood on the door?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right after that, verse 31, during the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, and you could just tell he had had enough when you read the way he words it. He says, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go and worship the Lord as you have requested it. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go. And also bless me. Their very presence was painful to him, and he wanted them gone. Everything, take your herds with you, just get out of my sight, get out of my life. He had been broken at that point. And to me, this is just, I kind of made mention of this last week, but I'm going to mention it again here. It's just amazing at the way that God chose to deliver his people. It would have been, I don't want to say it would have been easy, but it would have been the natural way that we think about things, to think about, okay, Moses goes and gets some allies and gets an army and comes in and fights against the army and drags God's people away and rescues them by some big exciting action scene kind of thing, with military and all. But that's not how he did it. No, God wanted the Pharaoh to send them out. He wanted to change the king's mind, and he wanted the king of Egypt himself to release the slaves. So he had to essentially break the king, which is what he did through this series of plagues up to this last one. And then God actually used the king. That's what's amazing to me. He used the king of Egypt to redeem the people. Yes, Moses was the tool to bring the message, to make the demands. But the one who actually released the Israelites was the king. The king was the tool of God at that moment. And that just proves it doesn't matter how evil a king might be, how ungodly a king might be, how sinful a king might be, even what the bad motives of a king might be. God still uses, the king or whoever to accomplish his will, even despite what the king may in their mind think they're doing. But it wasn't just the king, it was also the people. Because it says in verse 33, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So maybe they thought if they didn't send the people out, that maybe the next plague wouldn't just be the firstborn, it would just be everybody, that they would all suffer some kind of terrible plague. And all the people, the Egyptians, were ready to just drive them all out. So, and it wasn't just that they now had their liberty. They also had a lot of loot that they could take, the spoils of war, as you will, because they actually gave them gold and silver and clothing and all the livestock that they took and all this, that God actually changed the heart of the Egyptians, because it even says, the Israelites did as Moses instructed, this is verse 35, and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. And so they plundered the Egyptians. So it wasn't, they had their liberty, but they also basically financed their ability to go out and start a new nation on their own and have everything that they need to get going on their own. They went out just with armfuls of stuff. The Egyptians were like, not only do we want you gone, but here, just take it. Just take this stuff. Get out of my sight. That's how bad that they got after this night of death. They were ready for them all to be gone. So the Israelites then leave Egypt, not only with their freedom, but with everything they needed to start a new life. But the Egyptians have second thoughts. We're going to skip forward a little bit because the details of the last part of chapter 12 and chapter 13 are more about them getting ready to leave and assembling the people and marching out and having a feast and all these things that they do. So we're going to kind of just skip those details and go to the next important part of this story from the sake of the attitude of the people, is in chapter 14. And this is when we see that, well, first of all, I want to back up just a little bit and point out another important aspect of this. There were two different ways once they left Egypt. There were two different ways that they could have gone. There was a shorter route that they could have gone. However, that route would take them through populated and hostile areas. And back in chapter 13, God was telling Moses that if you take the people through these populated, hostile areas, if they have to face war, they'll turn around and go back to Egypt. So instead, we're going to take them the long way through the wilderness. That is the longer way, but is mostly uninhabited, and they won't have any resistance. And right now, that's for the best. So that's the reason they went the route that they did, towards the Red Sea. So they were actually out there encamped by the Red Sea. So in verse 5 of chapter 14, this is when we see the king having his second thoughts. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So in the light of day, now that the shock of what had happened with the plagues I'm sure it's still there because it hadn't been that long, but maybe the initial shock has passed, and they're thinking a little more clearly in the light of day. Suddenly they realize what's happened, what they've done. They have lost their labor force. I mean, without their slave labor force, who's going to build the roads? Who's going to build their temples? Who's going to plow their fields? Where are they going to get the servants for the homes of the rich people and the aristocrats and the royal families that use them as servants and slaves and everything? This would likely lead to the collapse of their economy. I mean, you got to realize that their entire economy was based on this slave labor. And you remove the labor, and now suddenly you've got to pay people wages to do all of those things. And that happened overnight. Overnight, literally. They realized that from a human perspective, from their perspective, they had made a dreadful error in letting them go. And with the economy failing, that would weaken the whole nation. They probably feel like it would set up the whole nation to fall, because as soon as word got out what had happened, I'm sure that's when Egypt's enemies would come in and attack them too, probably. So they realized they had made this terrible mistake. It would be devastating to their economy. So basically, they changed their mind. In verse 8, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites. So we know that God knew that all this was going to happen, that God intended for all this to happen. And this is why I say that this is the choice that faced the people of Israel, because though the Pharaoh let them go, he changed his mind, and so now he's going to pursue them. So at this point, not much faith had been required of the Israelites, except maybe, as you pointed out, putting the blood on the doorpost. That didn't make sense, but it didn't take much to do that, Mm-hmm. And with the Pharaoh telling them to leave, it didn't take much faith for them to follow Moses out the door, because the king was kicking them out at that point. But now their faith was really going to be tested. And I think right now, it's important to look at the last part of that verse 8. It's interesting. It says, he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. I think that's important to think about what their attitude was right now. Right now, they were marching out boldly. It's the word boldly is a translation of actually two words in the Hebrew. And those two words are with a high hand. Mm-hmm. And that word high there, the first word high, it means to rise up high, to be high or exalted, to exalt oneself, to be haughty, to be prideful. So in other words, they were marching out of there kind of with their chins up and their chests puffed out, like they had done something. Not like it was God that had done anything, like they had done something. They were kind of haughty and prideful and satisfied with themselves and like, oh yeah, we're all that.
We're bad.
We're bad. They were essentially self-satisfied and proud about their accomplishments like they had done anything. So the question is all this unjustified pride, is this going to lead to an epic fall? Because we know about pride, right? Pride becomes a fall.
Well, in a verse later, the subheading says, Israel rebels against God.
Yeah. Keep in mind now, when you think about the fact that they're about, in a few moments, to face the king's army, this is an entire generation, generation after generations. They had been slaves for 430 years. It's not like these are people that had just been enslaved during their lifetimes. Every one of these people were born into captivity, born into slavery. They didn't have any skill in battle. They didn't have any experience fighting. They didn't have any weapons. I don't know, maybe some of the things they got when they were given silver and gold, maybe they got some weapons too. Maybe they got some daggers or swords, I don't know. He doesn't say. But they really didn't have weapons to fight an army. And they had never had a chance or a reason to have any courage to fight in battle. And I'm sure that Pharaoh knew this. He knew that as soon as he caught up with them, he would just be a slaughter. So they're haughty and prideful right now, but that's about to change really fast. So the people are trapped. In chapter 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and suddenly they weren't also prideful anymore, because there were the Egyptians marching after them. Now, right, so far the experience of leaving Egypt had been pretty easy. All they had to do was take up everything and line up and march out with their chins up and everything. And they were now camped next to the sea. But here they see the approaching army. And we are told earlier that the Pharaoh had gotten 600 of his best chariots. And then he had also gotten all the rest of the chariots that he could find, even not the best chariots, plus all of his officers in the army and everybody else. Basically, he pretty much had his entire fighting force going out after them. So here they were. They're a big group. It says they were about 600,000 men, plus the women and children, so could have been upwards of 1 million or more people. It's the size of a small city. But a lot of them were women, children, old men. They'd been captive slaves. They weren't exactly, fighting men. They were slaves. So, and the greatest army on earth at that time was coming after them. So it says in the last part of verse 10 that they were terrified. Now, once again, that word terrified is actually 2 words in Hebrew. And it's translated in King James Version as sore afraid. And that first word, the adjective that's translated sore in the King James Version, it means vehemence or exceedingly, since it's an adjective, or depending on how it's used, it can mean louder and louder. The idea is the adjective describes the degree of whatever it's describing, in this case, fear. So they were certainly afraid, certainly terrified, but just translating it as simply terrified doesn't quite do the word justice in terms of the degree of it. A good way to say it, the way we might say it, is they were in mortal terror, mortal fear, sure that they were certain that they were about to die. They knew they couldn't withstand the Pharaoh and this army, that they would surely die. So here we have this attitude that we see over and over. I would say this is the same song, second verse, but this is actually the first verse of what we hear later on when they're in the wilderness. Verse 11, he says, they said to Moses, Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Does that sound familiar?
And then it begins.
What have you done to us by bringing us out in Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. This was a pattern that would repeat later. Remember, did you bring us out here in the wilderness to starve? Did you bring us out here to, when they came up to Canaan and they saw the walled cities
All you're going to
and the
give us
giants?
manna is all you're going to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, well, that
seemed.
seemed to be just their whole attitude that they had in their minds. But here's another interesting thing, what this reveals about it. And I've actually heard of this outside of this context before. I've read about this before. It's something in human nature that some people have. He says they say it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. I've read about this before. Sometimes when people are in captivity for long periods of time, I've read about this in a prison environment too. When you have a man, say, who spends like decades in prison, and then he's an old man, and he basically has known nothing else in his adult life but prison, and then he gets paroled, and he can't function.
Mm-hmm.
I've even heard of prisoners like that after they were released commit suicide. That for some reason, I don't know if comfort is the right word, but somehow there's that security of the sameness of being in prison and your needs are cared for. It may be oppressive, it may even be brutal, but at the same time, you've got a roof over your head, they're feeding you, and every day is a routine and you get used to it. You get accustomed to the captivity, and that suddenly, because along with freedom, along with liberty comes responsibility, comes you having to take care of yourself, you having to make decisions for yourself, comes uncertainty of what's going to happen next. Every day's not the same, routine like it is like in prison. It's like a syndrome that imprisoned people sometimes prefer the imprisonment even if it's brutal. And at this point, they have lived there. Again, we're talking about people who were born into captivity. They've known nothing else. All of a sudden, they're free, but they're also facing an uncertain future. And they're facing danger. And now they're almost thinking maybe we should have stayed back in our slavery, back in our captivity. Yeah, it was brutal. Yeah, we weren't free, but we had a roof over our heads. They gave us food to eat. Maybe it was gruel. Maybe it wasn't any good, but at least we had food to eat. At least we weren't, dead. So they weren't facing an army. They might have been facing slave masters with a whip, but they weren't facing an army. And so they were complaining that it would have been better for them to stay in Egypt instead of being slaughtered out in the desert. They are in a position now that the people have to choose. So Moses answered the people. In verse 13, Moses answered the people and said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." So Moses calls upon them to make this decision. Not to fear what the king can do. Not to fear what the world can do. He reminds them of what they've already known and what they've already seen, that it's not their strength or their ability that got them this far. It was the Lord who will fight for them, because it was the Lord who got them out of Egypt. It was the Lord who was the power behind the miracles that Moses showed, and the plagues that came upon them. All of that, and they're being passed over by the angel of death that didn't kill their firstborn. All of that, they've already seen the power of God. You mentioned this last week, Kim, is that they had seen the power of God in many ways, in ways that we haven't even seen the power of God. So he's saying it's God who's fighting for you. It's not me. It's not yourselves. It's not your own strength. It's God who's fighting for you. So he's telling them to stand firm and see the deliverance of the Lord. And so interesting in verse 14, in verse 14 he says, the Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still. Then in verse 15, the Lord says to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Well, that seems like a contradiction because Moses is saying stand still and God is saying move on. Is that really a contradiction? I'm saying no, it's not really, because when Moses is saying you only need to be still, he's not necessarily talking about physical motion.
No.
He's talking about the stillness of their spirit.
Yes.
No, the,
He's huh?
the New King James is what this Bible is, and it says, I just lost it.
What does it say?
Verse 14.
The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace.
Hold your peace.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that peace of your spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The idea of even if the army is bearing down on you, and even if it's time for you to move in the direction that God wants you to move, in your heart you're still. You have quietness, peacefulness of spirit. When the storms are raging, yet you have peace of spirit. That's what Moses is saying. It's not like he's saying, don't go anywhere, because God is telling them it's time to move on.
I think
But-
another way to say it could be trust God.
Yeah,
And also, think about being Moses. He's telling the people, God's going to rescue you, but he doesn't know how yet. So
Yeah.
can you imagine the pressure on him? Yeah, God's going to do this. I know God's got us. So the faith of Moses.
right.
But he didn't know until God
He
told
didn't.
him.
But I just think it's not a humorous situation, but it's just humorous the way it's worded. God saying, why are you crying out to me? Moses, because to your point, Moses is telling the people, trust God, trust God. But Moses is saying, what do I do? What do I do? It doesn't actually say that, but from the context, clearly, that's what Moses is saying to God. I'm telling the people to be still, but I don't know what to do. What do
Are
I
you
do?
crying to me
I'm
about
sorry.
it?
And he said, I already told you what to do, Moses.
Go.
Go! Sometimes we just don't listen to God.
But that's a big.
And we don't see the way. We don't know God's will.
I don't know how to
we,
Exactly.
we pray for God's
I mean,
will and
that
we
does
do
have to be a
God's will.
crazy thing. Like in my little kid mind, when I used to hear about the parting of the Red Sea, it just like flabbergasted me because I was like, so as they were walking through, were they seeing like all these fish swimming in the water and there's like a barrier and they can't come across? So there's like a whale sitting there like watching like, hey, what's that? As they're walking through. Like that's just how my little kid brain would think about it. I was like, were there like fish and they're all, I don't know.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, well.
I thought about
Welcome
that.
to my brain.
So, as we move on now, talking about the choice that the people make, here's a really interesting part that doesn't get pointed out a lot when we're talking about the parting of the Red Sea, but to me this is just fascinating and encouraging. In verse 19, the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them. Verse 20, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. And throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side.
Mm.
So neither went near the other all night long. So God separated and put a barrier between the armies of Egypt and God's people. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is a practical reason, and that leads to verse 21, when the actual event we've been leading up to happens, that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land, and the waters were divided. Now, if you're used to seeing this in the movies, it's, we're used to seeing the parting of the Red Sea almost like a big zipper going down the middle of it, and it happens in like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
That's not what the Bible says. It's something that took several hours of this fierce wind blowing to separate the waters. It took several hours. So there was that practical need for God to keep the armies away while he did that. But there was a second
You had to use
reason.
a smooth.
But there's a second reason. I think the second reason is he wanted to, this is speculation on my part, but it's what I believe. that he wanted to give the people time to think and pray and make a decision. One of the things that I have observed, I've seen it in the scriptures, but I've also just observed it from watching people. When people are in panic mode, they usually make the wrong decision. When you think you've got to make a life-changing decision like that without time to consider, oftentimes you make the wrong decision because you make it based on the emotions or the fears of the moment. And it's harder to see the long term. He wanted to give the people time to think about their choice before the armies could advance. So he gave them all night, not only from the practical standpoint of giving that parting of the sea time to happen, but for them to consider, to see everything, to see what God was doing in parting the sea. Well, at the first they probably didn't quite realize what was happening. They're like, what is this going on? But also to see that God was holding back the army, because they could see that too. They could see God holding back the army. They could see God protecting them. So that gave them time to say, okay, now we need to make a decision. So what is the decision? What is the choice? Well, once God opens that way for them to go, and then once the barrier to the armies has been removed, they have a decision to make. They can either go forward through the Red Sea towards the wilderness in the direction that God wants them to go, or they can turn back and surrender to the army. Now, my opinion is, and it doesn't say it in so many words, but I think it's backed up by going back to that verse where when they're changing their mind and they say, we've let the Israelites go and have lost their services. I really believe that if any of them had turned back and surrendered, they would have let them live. Because the whole point of them going out there was to bring them back. I don't think they would have just slaughtered them unless they resisted. Now, if they resisted, they would have. They would have slaughtered them. But I think if any of them had surrendered and gone back with their hands in the air or bowed to the ground or whatever, they would have taken them back to be slaves. Now, I have a feeling they'd have been harshly punished and things would have probably been worse than they were before. But it would have defeated the purpose of the king to go out and get them if he wasn't going to let them come back if they surrendered. So they could have surrendered. And in fact, that's what they said. They said it would be better to be alive in Egypt than to be dead here. That was their choice. That was their choice. Do we go forward and follow God, or do we surrender and go back to slavery in Egypt?
God gave the Egyptians a chance to think about it too. Here's these angry Egyptians coming after the Jewish people, and they should have been terrified of what was separating them from, the Israelites.
Right.
They had a chance, and it probably made a lot of them. Do we want to come against this powerful God?
Exactly.
And God's just saying, "Come at me."
Yeah, I know.
Come at me, bro.
Yeah.
So what will they do? What will they do? Well, we know what happens, that at this particular moment the people do show faith. Because in verse 21, it's what, as I read, that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea and pushed back the sea. And so the Israelites, verse 22, went through the sea on dry ground. And I think this is interesting, and I'm going to point this out too, because I don't think this is a meaningless detail. They went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, we don't know whether they could see fish through it, but they could see that big wall of water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, imagine for the moment, you're walking through on dry land, but you see these huge walls of water looking essentially like a frozen tidal wave on each side of you, and nothing holding it back except the power of God, but nothing visible holding back.
And the land was
Just the act of walking through that corridor where the walls were water, took faith. Because this is why, you see, it would have been just as easy for God, because God is God, right? God could have just snapped his fingers and just made all the water disappear. And it would have just been like a valley or something to go through. But he didn't do it that way. He chose to do it in a way where that wall of water was right next to him all the way. And that was a reminder that it was nothing but the power of God that was saving them at that moment. But it also wasn't something you just did like walking from here to there. I mean, I don't exactly know how many miles that was, but it was something that took a long, long time to do. They had to sit there. Imagine being in the bottom of that seabed, seeing, 500 feet or 1,000 feet of water above you. That had to be a very nerve-wracking thing. That was their act of faith. They had to trust Moses and they had to trust God that he would hold back the waters and hold back the army. Because until they got through, God did release the cloud and let the army through, but not until God's people were out of the way. So he was holding back the army and he was holding back the waters, and they had to walk through that by faith into the wilderness with that uncertain future and not really knowing, well, they didn't really know where they were going. God certainly knew, but they didn't really understand where they were going. They just knew they were going somewhere out. So this entire journey across that seabed was an act of faith, because they had to be wondering all the time, is that water going to come crashing down on me? That'd be a frightening thing.
I wonder if they had water spray on them
maybe,
continuous way, because there's waves,
Yeah, maybe, I don't know.
See, I guess in my mind too, I didn't realize. I've read it before, so I guess I knew. But it's one of those details that just doesn't stick with you. That there were so many of them. Like in my mind, I'm picturing like a couple hundred people.
It's close to 1 million.
But that
Maybe.
blows my mind. Like in my mind, that was a new detail to me, even though I know I've read it. That's never stuck before. I always just picture a couple hundred people walking through it, but 1 million people. That's a lot of people.
It is a lot of people. A lot of them, as I said, were elderly people, children, and plus they've got livestock and they've got they're pulling wagons. It's not like just taking a little wade through a creek somewhere. This was a major logistical undertaking. Imagine moving 1 million people.
Pulling wheels on sand.
Yes, and all that. Just imagine that. And so, all the while, watching this wall of water over you. This was an act of faith, collectively, by the people. Because they could have refused to go in. They could have said, I ain't going in there. I'll wait and I'll take my chances with the army. I'll just surrender and go back to Egypt. I'll take my chances. That would have been the easy way. To surrender to what you know. To surrender to where you came from. Surrender to what you know. Even if it's captivity. But they didn't. They followed Moses. They followed God. They went through. So, skipping forward to verse 30, because again I'm just looking at the highlights. That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Because, of course, after they got through, and then he released the clouds out of the way, and the Egyptians ran stupidly on through them. That had, surely, it's hard to believe they did it, but they did.
You know, knock the wheels off.
And then God released the walls of water on them, and it says none survived. Every single one of them drowned. And it says they saw Egyptians lying dead on the shore. They started washing up on the shore, corpses. And when the Israelites saw the great power that the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and here it is, the last verse of chapter 14, and put their trust in him, and Moses his servant. And that word trust there, in the Hebrew, is the equivalent Hebrew word to the Greek word pistis, which means faith, belief, trust. It's the Old Testament version of faith. They put their trust in him. So for the moment, like I said, it's a little nugget of faith. And it doesn't mean that they trust Him in everything for the rest of their lives, because we know once they get into the wilderness and they face those challenges, their faith wavers, and we know that. We've talked about it already ad nauseum. But at this moment in time, they put their trust in God. They believed God. By faith it was the people passed through the Red Sea. Yes, it was God who parted the Red Sea, but God didn't drag them across kicking and screaming. They had to do it themselves. They had to step on that dry ground between the walls of water. They had to believe that God was going to hold those waves back and hold the army back to give them time to cross into the wilderness. So by faith, the people passed through the Red Sea. And there are times we face those same kinds of things, where we might see some dry ground ahead of us, but there's the walls of water on each side, and we're nervous about taking that step. But if we know it's the right step, even if it's to what to us is an uncertain future in the wilderness, if we know it's God's plan, and we know that God has opened this way for us, He won't force us through. We have to choose to do it ourselves. But He will hold the water back if it's His will for us to go that path. He will hold the water back. And He'll hold the army back behind us long enough for us to get through. Doesn't mean there won't be challenges face us ahead. There certainly were for the Israelites. But for that moment, that was God's plan. He called upon them to do it, and they believed Him, and they trusted Him, and it saved a nation. Saved a nation.